Welcome to the third video on negative behaviors in children. And this time we're going to be talking about maintaining a positive environment. So this would refer to maybe a classroom setting or a tutoring setting or in an after-school program or extracurricular activity, whatever it might be where you have groups of children. How do we maintain that positive environment for them? So we're going to, as usual, look at a few theorists and look at their work and see how that influences how we approach dealing with negative behaviors. And one of them ones I am a big fan of is Alfie Kohn. He's actually a more modern theorist, has done a lot of research, a lot of work on a wide range of things, but one of the main ones has to do with behavior and student discipline or classroom management style topics. Kohn discusses a lot about competition and how the use of extrinsic motivation, he believes, comes out of capitalism. And so he thinks that is a negative side effect of capitalism and that we are constantly obsessed with competition. And he believes that it doesn't actually belong in schools, that instead we should be focused more on intrinsic motivation and autonomy, not external competition. And so he is very much of the field of critical pedagogy and utilizes Marxist principles to discuss how children and their curiosity will govern how learning can take place. And there's no need for extrinsic motivation if you actually create the right environment for that curiosity to grow. And so he's very against standardization. And so he would argue that the more standardized your environment, your curriculum, your assessments, your lessons, the worse off you're going to be. Now, as educators, sometimes we're in an environment where that's not an option and we have to assess and we have to do some standardization. But if we know that it is not necessarily positive, then we can still try our best to avoid those scenarios when we are in control of choosing what kind of solution to use or what kind of approach to take. Kohn is very much against positive reinforcement, which sounds a little bit unusual, right? We're used to the idea of positive reinforcement. But Kohn would argue that if you are constantly offering an incentive, then it's not intrinsic motivation anymore. Kids are not learning because they want to learn. They're learning because they want the sticker or the points or the stars or the treats, or even just teacher approval. Right. So we want to think about how we encourage students and in what way are we encouraging them. And if we're just constantly offering some kind of reward, then it's actually going to have a long-term negative effect on the child. The next theorist we're going to talk about is Jacob Koonin, very practical theorist that talks a lot about how to manage groups of children. There's a few major concepts that I think are really relevant to any kind of classroom or school or even extracurricular setting. And these involve being proactive. These are very straightforward ideas, by the way, but looking around and seeing what could become a problem and trying to be proactive to prevent it, as opposed to being retroactive and having to correct students. You look for potential problems and be proactive about it. The next one is the ripple effect. And this is something we often notice in rowdy classes or places where kids are what we would consider misbehaving or out of control. We see a negative effect, but Koonin argues there's a positive ripple effect that can happen. So when some kids are doing something positive and the teacher points out, look at this positive thing happening here, look at how well this is going, and appreciates that accomplishment or that positive behavior, then now all of a sudden everybody wants to do it. Now, it sounds a little bit in conflict with the previous person, and some might interpret it that way. But I believe both ideas can exist, because if we are talking about incentivizing everything with points and rewards, I would be on the side of Kohn and say that is not necessary, right? But it is okay to acknowledge when something is going well and to praise that, especially if it is an effort. We want to praise effort. We want to praise accomplishments in a way that acknowledges the time and energy put into it. And I think that that is something that will create a positive ripple effect where children around want to accomplish the same thing and want to get that same acknowledgement. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We do also have this set of lesson ideas that Kunin talks about, and those involve with itness, which is kind of a made up word, but means just a teacher that is with it and knows what's going on in the lesson, not oblivious to things going on in the room, or ignoring things, or not anticipating things that they need to notice. Overlapping, which is exactly what it sounds like. So I'm going to overlap ideas and activities so that one has some nice, it has that nice connection to the next thing. We also want to think about momentum and how we're moving through the lesson and what pace we're going. Smoothness has to do with, are we ready to transition to the next thing? And does it make sense? And then can we maintain a group focus where we're all talking about the same things and we're all focused on the same thing and we're all interested in the same thing? It's can be hard to achieve, but it is possible in all groups of kids to get that to that point. And it happens when often teachers are really utilizing those strategies we talked about in the first two videos, being really respectful of students, treating them as equals, and using that kind of relationship building approach. So it's much easier to get them involved in the lesson. Additionally, if you use sort of an inquiry or student curiosity as the focus, then you're more likely to keep that group focus of everyone involved. So what? Okay, so what is the practical side of this? We heard those two theories, and they are very practical focus theories anyways. But I think we need to think about, how do we get students excited about learning? So here's an example of a problem. Let's pretend, and this is actually not really pretend, these are real stories. Let's say that in an after-school program or even in classroom, a teacher says, who would like to try a science experiment? Okay, the problem with that question is, does everybody in the room really understand what you're asking them? Do they automatically think that they are going to be interested in a science experiment? And a lot of kids might say, no, I'm not interested. I don't care. Science is boring. I don't want to know. And so if you get that negative response, now what? Now you're put in a position to have to try and sell the idea, and you have to become the salesman. and that's not really what you intended to do, right? So you don't want to put yourself in that position for kids to reject you and your idea before you even start. So I would suggest, don't even ask that question. Just give them a little taste of how cool the science could be in the first place. Here's a true story of an instructor I know who started off by taking out some supplies. And instead of saying something like, who would like to try a science experiment, or who wants to do science with me? Instead, she said, I wonder if this is going to work. And she laid out some materials and she started messing around with them and setting them up. And she had liquids and she had testing tubes, and it looked really interesting. And so now students started asking, well, what's going to happen? What are you doing? And then all of a sudden they're interested and they're standing around and they want to get involved. The kids were ecstatic about that lesson. They saw all kinds of chemical reactions. They learned about pH balance. They learned about pH levels and interactions between one chemical and another. And I'm probably ruining, all the terminology there, but the idea was that the kids were very excited about it. And instead of saying that science was boring, like they actually had started to say in the morning, during that lesson, they were saying, this is so much fun. I love science. Science rules. This is great. And so they were really excited about it because no one gave them a chance to reject it. Because giving them a chance to accept or reject it before they've actually learned it is not really a fair scenario. They don't really know much about what you're asking them. So it's better to not give them that choice, but to just show them how cool it could be. Now, if she had tried and they still were not interested, that's a different story. And that's when I would say choice matters. That's our next point here. We want to think about options. Kids always do better and behave better if they feel like they have options. If you remember in that first video, one of the motivators and one of the drivers behind human behavior is wanting to feel power, wanting to feel independence, wanting to feel freedom. And so those kind of drivers keep people focused on something when they have a choice, because now they feel in control of their situation. Even if the two choices are things that you picked out for them, even if one is the one you really want them to do and it's more appealing, the fact that they got to choose makes a big difference, right? So I would suggest doing that as often as possible. This leads us to The reasoning behind some of these ideas, and I want us to back up a little bit and look at just a broader picture of why these things might work. And if you haven't heard of these theories of behaviorism versus constructivism, you should look them up. This is just a very quick Cliff Notes version. But behaviorist models of instruction suppose that learning happens through reinforcement of reward and consequences. So, and that's very much the system that we often are trained in. So that's why we're all pretty comfortable with it. I'm going to reward you or punish you. I'm going to admire what you've done. I'm going to talk about it being great, or I'm going to scold you because you didn't do it right. Or I'm going to give you a point. I'm going to take away a point. I'm going to give you a reward to take home, or I'm going to pull a card and change your color on a chart that humiliates you and shows everybody that you misbehaved. All of these are behaviorism. And although they do work for a short period of time, they are not strategies that contribute to long-term true cognitive engagement. They are immediate behavioral engagement. They are not long-term cognitive engagement, meaning the child is not necessarily completely mentally committed to what's going on. They're just reacting out of fear of being rewarded or punished. And so the other perspective that we as educators tend to lean towards is constructivism. And there's another version of it called social constructivism, which means that one, we suppose that learning happens through constructing and building new ideas, not through rehearsal and reinforcement, but through building new ideas and connections, right? So I have this idea that I know, I'm learning this new one, I'm connecting the things I used to know with the things I know now, and all that's happening through social interaction, hence the term social constructivists. So this means that learning happens when people are communicating, working together, which means and implies very much that people are equals, right? Which is what we talked about earlier in the second video. So I would highly suggest you go back and watch the first and second if you haven't already at this point. But this model means that learning is also intrinsically motivated, right? And that's a better long-term approach because now they're learning for the sake of learning, not learning for the sake of reward or punishment, which is fleeting. It's not going to always be there, right? What happens when I don't care about stickers anymore? Now, am I still going to learn? Am I still going to push myself? Maybe, maybe not. So we want to think about the reward and punishment doesn't always work. Now, it doesn't always work in academic environments, and it also doesn't work with correcting negative behaviors either. And one teacher once told me when we talked about consequences, because we had a school-wide system of consequences and rewards, and for a lot of kids, it wasn't working. And the teacher once said something very simple, but very wise. If it was going to work, it would have worked by now, right? And so as we were middle school teachers, meaning 6 or 7 or 8 years in, if the kid hasn't responded to this behaviorism yet, it's not going to happen, right? So what do we do then? How can we be more intrinsically motivated? How can we find that spark of interest that's going to make them intrinsically motivated? Well, some of that has to come with respect and building relationships, right? So when correcting negative behaviors, redirecting negative behaviors, and maintaining that positive environment, one-on-one discussions are always going to do better when there's a problem. It's never going to be something that replaces the whole group instruction, of course. We can't do that all the time. But when there's a problem, it's better to talk to a kid one-on-one. You'll always see better results no matter what. The next is to seek for children to understand the expectations, not just respond out of fear, right? If I just say, stop leaning in your chair. If you don't stop leaning in your chair, I'm going to take away your game privileges. If you don't stop leaning in your chair, I'm going to take away your chair. If you don't stop leaning in your chair, I'm going to call your mom. There's always consequences. And we'll notice that a lot of times kids will call your bluff and they will keep leaning in the chair, right? So there's always these things that occur that are pushing the limits. And whether the child is pushing the limits because they want to see what you're going to do, or they're pushing the limits because they really, truly are not learning it. One of my mentor teachers when I was brand new told me teaching is repeating. If you don't like repeating yourself, do not be an educator because that is what you are going to do over and over and over. You're going to say the same idea. The challenge is now finding a new way to say it, right? So it's better to repeat yourself And it's better to repeat yourself in a different way as opposed to threatening, right? Because if you threaten, now I have to follow through. Not only do I have to follow through, that's unpleasant. And not only do I have to follow through on something that is unpleasant, now I also have to keep coming up with something bigger and scarier each time I do it. And I don't want that, right? That's not really the environment I want. I want a positive environment. So I want to build a relationship. I want the kid to understand why not to lean in the chair. I want the kid to understand why we need to clean up our mess. I want the kid to understand why it's better to share, or why science is going to be fun and you should just try it, right? And so we want to create an environment where we respect them, talk to them as equals, instead of threatening or taking things away. So that leads us to the idea of preventing problems before they happen. We talked about this already, but speaking to children privately, when you start to see a problem, it's better to nip it in the bud, right? Go talk to them one-on-one, not in front of their peers. No matter what they say about not caring what people think, all kids care about what people think all the time. We all do, right? So it's best to not do that in public at all. Even if you just pull them aside and speak quietly, it's always going to be better. Have an alternative activity ready to choose between what you're asking them to do and something else. That will almost always give you some good results. Doesn't mean every kid will go for it, but a lot of children, when given a choice, will choose the right one that you wanted, but make the second one something else that they might also learn the same ideas if they're willing, right? Spending more time pointing out positive behaviors than negative ones. Also, what are you talking about most of the time? Are you talking about following the rules? Are you talking about behaving? Or are you talking about learning and some cool ideas, positive things that resemble what you really want the environment to reflect? Kids pay attention to what you say most. What do you talk about most of the time? So be cognizant of that. Limit transition periods. Transitions are really hard. They are difficult. So it's best to plan them and have a lot of short activities, things you can do quickly to keep kids occupied. A lot of times misbehavior happens because kids are bored and they're not sure what to do with their time. And most kids will do something. Very few kids are mentally tired like adults are. A lot of times when we have time to sit and do nothing, we'll take it. But kids don't do that, right? So their brains are always going. They want to be busy. Provide that and give them a chance to do something else while you're getting the next thing ready, if that's the case. It might save you a lot of heartache later. When working with groups, always try to find ways for everyone to be involved. Everyone needs to contribute. Everyone needs a turn. Everybody needs to be important. We talked earlier about the levels of engagement as far as when am I misbehaving? A lot of times it has to do with not feeling important or feeling like I'm part of the group, right? So that's important to think about. Your engagement goes down and then your misbehavior goes up when those things are not happening. Important thing to think about is also how we talk to children. Instead of making demands or commands, asking them to help you solve a problem, right? So you see a big mess, instead of saying, hey, clean that up, you might say, hey, could you help me put this away? I think this goes in this box, right? Could you help me? And a lot of times kids respond much better to asking them to solve a problem and fix something, even if it's something simple like cleaning up, than they do a command or, what they might perceive as yelling an order at them. We talked about this before with our second video, but I'm going to reiterate it. Treating children as your equal. Behavior control through power dynamics does not work. And if it does work with some kids, those kids are doing it out of fear, not respect. So we want to make sure that we're building respect. We build respect by earning it. We earn it by showing that they are equal to us and we are going to treat them the way we would treat an adult guest in our home. And that Heimgenott example is a really perfect one. So consider how we talk to children. Are we treating them as an equal at all times? It doesn't mean that you're not in charge. It just means that you want to show them that respect as a whole person and as someone who's capable, and assume the best in them. Building better relationships to promote strengths is really effective. So you talk about what they're good at, what have they accomplished, how good they're doing at something, and pointing that out. And how hard they're working at something. Those are really positive things that can help you build those relationships with children who are maybe more standoffish. And last but not least, feeling vulnerable and being vulnerable with children. Sometimes adults react because they feel disrespected. They feel like I'm the adult. They should automatically respect me. They're not showing respect. And so why not just be vulnerable and say, hey, I feel that feels hurtful when you do that. Were you trying to be hurtful? And you'll be very surprised how often, if you ask a child, did I hurt your feelings? Because you seem like you're upset or you seem like you were unhappy. And I want to make sure I didn't hurt your feelings. I want to correct that if I did. You'd be very surprised how often that gets you a really good result because they're acknowledging, they're being acknowledged as a whole person. And now they're going to acknowledge what you're saying and see you as a whole person. And that's the goal of helping these negative behaviors stop, right? All right. I hope that this was helpful and gave you some good tips. Please reach out to me if you need more help.